You are now listening to the Protestant Libertarian Podcast. All right, guys, welcome to another episode of the Protestant Libertarian Podcast. My guest today is Laurie Calhoun. She is a senior fellow at the Libertarian Institute, a philosopher, and an author of several books and articles, many of which discuss the military-industrial complex. She recently wrote a piece for the Libertarian Institute called the MIC Cult. Laurie, welcome to the Protestant Libertarian Podcast.
Hello, thank you for having me.
Hey, this article, again, when I read it, I've been wanting to address this issue on the show for a while, and I just don't have the knowledge or the expertise to do it, and I didn't really have a good way in. The article is absolutely perfect, and so I'm really excited to talk to you about it today. But before we begin, just tell us a little bit about yourself, like your background, the work you do for the Libertarian Institute, that kind of stuff.
Sure. I got into writing about war sort of through the back door because I have a degree in chemistry, and I was in science for a while, and then I was a graduate student in philosophy at Princeton. And during my time at Princeton, George H.W. Bush waged the 1991 Gulf War. And I wrote some letters to the editor and an op-ed in the school paper. I watched all the congressional debate on it, and I was convinced that it was not something we needed to do. So I wrote a little bit about war then, and then I came back to war when Bill Clinton started bombing Kosovo in 1999, and then after that I've just been writing about war ever since. So at the Libertarian Institute, I was invited by Scott in the midst of the COVID crisis. He said, are you still writing? Because I have a blog for my drone assassination book, and I was working on some other projects not related directly to drone killing, and so I hadn't posted much on my blog. So Scott contacted me and invited me to contribute again to the Libertarian Institute, and the rest is history. I've been doing it ever since. So.
Yeah, awesome. Well, describe. So there are, when I first heard the term military-industrial complex, I was probably in middle school and high school, and I just assumed, I guess because I grew up watching a bunch of James Bond movies, that I was some sort of conspiracy theory kind of whatever. But then when I actually started studying U.S. history and realized that Eisenhower was the one that came up with the term and that it actually describes a phenomenon that takes place in our country, I realized that there was a lot to that. So a lot of the people that listen to the show might not understand what the military-industrial complex is. So could you just describe what that is before we get into the article for people that might not understand exactly what we're talking about?
Sure, absolutely. It's a network of connections between the defense industry and various aspects of our society. It's grown and ramified to include all sorts of aspects of our culture. So I now call it the military-industrial, congressional, academic, media, logistics, banking, pharmaceutical complex. I think I did it in the wrong order, but anyway, there are 8 of them. There are 8, major ones right now, so I call it the octopoid MIC at this point. When Eisenhower first warned about it, he wanted to say that we need to be careful about the influence of the defense industry on our civil society. So are we going to be buying bombs, paying for bombs as opposed to schools? Are we going to pay for huge planes to drop the bombs instead of fixing our roads, etc.? So he was worried about it then, but it has just gotten worse and worse over the years, partly because of all the subcontracting connections. So I could give you a simple example which will clarify. Let's say you're a businessman whose company produces nuts and bolts. Nothing deadly about nuts and bolts. But it turns out the Pentagon uses tons of nuts and bolts. Okay, so it could be that the way you profit in your business is that you get huge contracts with the Pentagon. And if the Pentagon drops its contracts, maybe you'll go bankrupt and maybe you'll go out of business. So this gives you, at least in the back of your mind, some reason for supporting every pro-defense initiative, because your own business is profiting as a result of it. Well, it turns out that the Defense Department uses all sorts of things in all sorts of aspects of our society, and so people who don't even know that they subcontract for the Pentagon sometimes do, but the influence is everywhere. And one of the most nefarious influences, of course, the media. When you have missile manufacturers, weapons manufacturers who are behind our news programs, for example, then they have an influence on how wars are portrayed to the populace. And so you'll see a very slanted depiction. This has gone on at least since the 1991 Gulf War, and it's particularly marked today. So you don't see a lot of anti-war people on network television. There are a few exceptions, like Kennedy on Fox Business News has Scott Horton on frequently, but that's really an exception. You don't see anyone inviting Noam Chomsky on, for example. Right. You don't see it. So you see the usual suspects, Max Boot and Bill Kristol and everyone who wants to go wage war. And so as a result of this, the populace gets this idea that, oh, well, all the experts agree, so this is obviously what we should be doing. So, for example, the Ukraine situation, we've been sending them tons and tons of quote-unquote military aid, which is really deadly weapons, and everyone is on board. So the Congress is a part of it too, because they're influenced by defense industry lobbyists in Washington. There are tons of these people who take them out to lunch, who donate to their campaigns. And so as a result of all this, we just have this colossus, this military colossus, and people don't even recognize it for what it is anymore. If you're an outsider, they think there's something wrong with you if you criticize a war effort. But in fact, it's unclear that the tenets of this, what I call cult, are valid at all. One is that bombing is actually going to resolve conflict. Right. And the other is that offensive military aggression is a form of defense. So every time we send bombs somewhere, or every time we go bomb someplace, we're actually supposedly defending people in the homeland, when in fact this is not the case.
Yeah. Well, I love what you brought up at the end of that description. That was a great description of the military-industrial complex. In your article, you do refer to it as a cult, which is one of the things that caught my attention with the article as I read it. And again, having grown up in church and actually, knowing people that have been involved in religious organizations that are pretty cultish, you describe the MIC as a cult. What are some of the particular aspects of the military-industrial complex that, from your perspective, make it particularly cult-like?
Well, you can't actually refute these basic tenets of the MIC through anything empirical. So, example, War on Terror, you might say, was a failure. We left Afghanistan to the Taliban. Okay, so the Taliban is now in power again after 20 years of trying to kill the Taliban. We left Afghanistan to the Taliban, and they inherited all of the weapons and equipment that we left behind. So you might say, okay, well, that was clearly a failure of the Pentagon. The approach didn't work. We didn't really accomplish anything. So maybe we should step back and hold off on any further interventions. But that's not what happened. What happened instead is people are just rushing forward to support the very next intervention now in Ukraine. Biden sent soldiers back to Somalia. So it looks like no matter what the Pentagon does, they get renewed support, and they get a greater military budget as a result. So another example would be right after 9/11, the Bush administration bureaucrats received intel according to which there might be these attacks using airplanes, but they didn't do anything. So you might say, well, Congress should have redressed them and assessed what went on. Instead, they massively increased their power and their budget and gave them the berth to do whatever they wanted to do, and up to including extraordinary rendition, what they called enhanced interrogation techniques, now we call it torture, and worst of all, summary execution of suspects without indictment or trial. So it's a cult in the sense that no matter what they do, no matter how badly they fail, they get more support. The defense budget just keeps increasing. So you can ask yourself, what would they have to do in order for Congress to decide to decrease the defense budget? And it has the aspect of cult funding, because in a small religious cult, you'll have people whose leader says they're going to do something. I'm going to effect this miracle. He doesn't do it. And then instead of saying, oh, you're actually a shyster or a fraud, oh, we need to be more faithful. We need to pray more. We need to go out and drum up more funds for you, sell flowers on street corners, etc. They become more devoted to him, even when he fails to do what he says he's going to do. So you could say the same thing for our defense apparatus. They said they were going to do all these things. We're going to go democratize Iraq, and we're going to we're going to make the Middle East this wonderful place to live. Well, they didn't. They wrecked countless societies, millions of lives. They killed people, maimed people, and terrorized people all over the Middle East. And they not only did all of these horrible, negative, direct things, but they also generated a lot of sympathy for the cause of our enemies. So 9/11 was perpetrated by a handful of factional terrorists. And one way it could have been addressed would be through criminal investigation and prosecution. Go get the people who did this to us, take them out, get rid of them, get them on trial. Instead, the Bush administration waged entire wars on entire societies and killed people who had nothing to do with 9/11. I mean, people in Afghanistan, they would interview them and they'd be like, "What's 9/11?" They didn't even know what it was,
Right.
So what ties the Western military apparatus to the behavior of recognizably cultish factional terrorists is that they're willing to kill people who are entirely innocent as a way of getting back at the people with whom they have grievances. So Osama bin Laden was angry with the U.S. government over the 1991 Gulf War and its aftermath, the hundreds of thousands of children who were killed as a result of the sanctions, the occupation of Middle Eastern territories. He was angry about all these things, but he was angry with the U.S. government. So what did he do? He went and killed 3,000 civilians, or he ordered the killing of these people. And the Bush administration effectively did the same thing. They turned around and did the same thing. They didn't pay attention to any of the grievances that were aired by the terrorists of 9/11. Instead, they doubled down and multiplied the grounds for grievance. So that's why, for example, ISIS exists. ISIS exists because we invaded Iraq. And a lot of these people resisted the invasion in the way that you might resist an invasion on our soil, but they were painted as terrorists. So,
Yeah. Well, and that's one of the things too. Like, so when I was in seventh grade when 9/11 happened, and I'm from Kentucky, and so everyone here, we're listening to Toby Keith, and we're all jacked up about going to war. Like, we're really excited about it, and it goes back to what you were talking about. Like, almost everyone in the media in 2001 suggested that the wars in Afghanistan and then in Iraq were going to be good, and they all made kind of the argument that you just alluded to, that this was about freedom. Like, the reason why these people were attacking us had nothing to do with our policies. It had everything to do with the fact that we had all these Western freedoms, and we let women walk around in blue jeans and go to school and things like that. But that just wasn't the case. And so one of the things that I want to kind of address, because it is all tied up with the military industrial complex, is what's wrong with the assumption that we were attacked on 9/11 because they hated our freedoms. And you kind of addressed that a little bit, but I think it's a lot deeper than most people realize.
sure. I mean, that was really a propaganda line that was used to promote the war. And you might say that they are not, the people who perpetrated those attacks were not advocates of democracy and freedom. So that may be true. They're religious zealots, if you like. But they articulated very clear grounds for taking up jihad, which to their minds, like it or not, is analogous to the Western concept of just war. They felt like they were retaliating on behalf of innocent people who had been harmed by the U.S. military. And so saying that it is that they hate us for our freedom is just a simple way to shut down any sort of criticism. So instead of causing the military to do some self-reflection and think about, in fact, did we go overboard in 1991? Were the sanctions effective, or did they actually just kill a bunch of innocent people? I mean, sanctions are a big problem because they always they're claimed by the people who support them to weaken the government, and in fact, they just harm the civilian population, because the head of the government, particularly a dictator, has access to any and everything that there is. So if there's a reduced amount of everything, the dictator still gets first dibs on everything. So it doesn't actually diminish their capacity to rule, and it harms the people living under them. So the main problem with ignoring the grievances aired by the people who have been depicted as the evil enemy. Every single person who has been attacked down the line. Saddam Hussein, Slobodan Milosevic, Saddam Hussein again, Bashar al-Assad. Now we have Vladimir Putin. They're all painted as the evil enemy, and we're supposed to just ignore their concerns, whatever they may be. And because we've already defined them as the evil enemy, then the only way we can address what they do is through the use of military force. So this is a ploy as old as warfare itself. You just say you can't negotiate with these people, and then you refuse to negotiate on the grounds that you can't negotiate with them. So Bush said we don't negotiate with terrorists, even though the grievances that were aired by people like Osama bin Laden, like him or not, had some overlap with non-violent criticism that was shared by people like Noam Chomsky, etc., people who would never kill anyone, but they were concerned with the overreach of the U.S. military. So another example is Anwar al-Awlaki, U.S. citizen Anwar al-Awlaki, who was killed by U.S. drone in Yemen in 2011 without indictment or trial by the Obama administration. And he had a lot of concerns about how the war on terror was being prosecuted. He actually came out initially after 9/11 and denounced the attacks. He was a moderate cleric at that point, and he said, we got to be careful. You don't want to alienate all of the Muslim population. And what happened is he himself became radicalized over the course of the war on terror as a result of things like rendition and, the use of drones to kill people and all of the things that went on, the torture. And so he became radicalized. And then rather than allowing him to stand trial, in which case he would have articulated his anger at the U.S. government for what they were doing throughout the war on terror, they just silenced him by taking him out with a drone. So this tactic is, they say that they're going to kill these people to prevent further terrorist attacks, but they could equally prevent further terrorist attacks by throwing these people in solitary confinement and allowing them to stand trial. But they don't want to let them stand trial because they don't want them to be able to articulate their grievances, some of which, like it or not, are valid.
Yeah, no, that makes perfect sense because if they went on trial, obviously there'd be a huge media presence and they would have an opportunity to say in front of everybody, like, look, we support this because of what the United States has done in the wake of 9/11. One of the crazy things about that to me too was that, and this I remember like seeing this on TV when I was younger too. Is like right after 9/11, the way that it was portrayed, it was like Osama bin Laden and other kind of militant terrorists in the Middle East. There was kind of this, there was this push to make it seem like everybody that was in Afghanistan was against us, like everybody was morally evil. And I know that they showed like clips on TV of like Arabs together cheering the towers falling as they were watching it from over there. So the media did such a great job of making it seem as if not just the people who were responsible for this were morally evil, but like everybody, the citizens, everyone that surround them in the country, and I think that goes back to why there was a lot of confusion, even between like defining who is in Al-Qaeda and who is a part of the Taliban. Like I didn't understand the difference. Bush told me that they were all just terrorists. So, and you kind of addressed that, but that's just a part of the way that the military-industrial complex changes the way that we think about people around the world. They portray everyone as evil, regardless of whether or not they're actually involved in these attacks.
That's right. And another very negative aspect of their portrayal is they operate under the assumption that American lives are somehow more valuable than non-American lives. So yes, 3,000 people were killed on September 11th, and that is horrible. But since then, millions of people in the Middle East have been killed, and most of them have not been reported on. So basically, we get a very slanted depiction of the war, and then people don't understand why anyone would be angry about the war on terror. Well, actually, if you're on the ground and you see what was done to these societies, you would understand that, in fact, you've upended so many people's lives. You've created widows and orphans and destroyed homes and all these things in the name of retaliation against seeking quote unquote justice in the aftermath of the 9/11 attacks. But you're perpetrating all of these injustices. So all of these people who have suffered injustice, multiple times more than the Americans who were harmed and killed on September 11th. So this this refusal to depict the actual consequences of our military policies keeps people in a sort of box where they automatically reflexively support every defense initiative because they think defense is good. So example would be the $40 billion print money for Ukraine bill is how I call it. Okay, so every single Democrat voted for that. That's $40 billion. I mean, a billion, I wrote this on Twitter. I was like, do people realize that a billion is 1,000 million? So like these so-called progressive representatives in the House of Representatives, they all voted for this. I'm like, you supposedly care about all these other wish list items that cost a tiny fraction of that amount of money, and you're just automatically just knee-jerk reflex, you call it defense, I'll vote for it. And that's what's happened. So even the people who supposedly understand what's going on in the Middle East automatically approve of every single defense budget, every single allocation of quote, they call it military aid, which is a euphemism for deadly weapons, right? So even knowing what happened to the weapons we sent to Syria, we ended up arming ISIS in Syria, and we also know that you lose control of these weapons. As soon as they leave our shores, we don't really control where they go. So in the end, the Taliban in Afghanistan ended up with tons of military equipment because we just left it there. And same thing in Syria. Lots of terrorists ended up, initially the US government said, we're going to send these weapons to, I believe they're called appropriately vetted moderate rebels, which sounds like a gobbledygook thing. But the truth was they were immediately transferred to the most radical and bloodthirsty factions that were there on the ground. And so we have no control over it. But what's happened in the US is people just assume, military aid, that's a good thing. No, it's going to be used to kill people. In Ukraine, it's being used to kill not only Russian soldiers, but also Ukrainian soldiers, also Ukrainian civilians. It's we actually had a couple of news articles just recently about how it looks like only 30% of the weapons that have been sent to Ukraine have shown up in the hands of Ukrainian soldiers. So where are the rest of them? They're on the black market. They're being sold to terrorists, for heaven's sake. So this happens because people never really grasped the effects of the war on terror. If they understood how we threw away trillions of dollars through the war on terror and got nothing in return. In fact, we got less than nothing because thousands of troops lost their lives and thousands, many more troops, I believe there are 40,000 homeless right now, had their lives wrecked. So the ones who haven't committed suicide have also suffered on top of all the ones who were killed. So that's what we got for our investment. So if it were a normal business type model, when people fail, you stop allowing them to continue on. But with the MIC, it's exactly the opposite. The more they fail, the more money they get. And the logic, I suppose, is that they needed more. They might have won in Afghanistan if only we had given them more. Well, no, that's not actually true. When you analyze how the money was spent and how corruption was spread throughout the Afghanistan society, you realize that, in fact, it was a big scam. I mean, Julian Assange actually said in 2011 that the purpose of the Afghanistan war was not to win, but it was to just continue to transfer funds. So he basically depicted it as a money laundering operation, which sounded sort of, crazy at the time. But now, when you look at the actual, the conclusion to the Afghanistan war is Taliban's back in power, and now they're really, really heavily armed. Right. So that's a fail right there. And yet, instead of, again, undergoing some form of self-reflective critical process, the Pentagon just forges ahead with the next thing. So now we're going to go provoke Vladimir Putin. So what if he has nuclear arms and we're threatening the end of civilization? We're going to do it anyway because it's just inexorable. It can't stop. It's a perpetual motion machine at this point.
Yeah, that hit on so many issues that I wanted to talk about too. One of the things that I really loved about your piece is that, as you just said, like every single military failure in the 21st century has led to an increase in the Defense Department budget, like every single one. And as you were saying, like it's the military-industrial complex is kind of the driver of that. So what are the mechanics behind that? How does the military-industrial complex have the ability to influence Americans to support political representatives that will go to Washington and then continue to give the Defense Department more money despite of all of the failures from the last 20 years?
Yeah, it's multifaceted. I mean, one is something I mentioned before, which is lobbyists in DC who are super powerful and they get representatives and senators on their side. Another is the media. So the media depicts war in a particular way, which makes everyone think, oh, freedom is not free. They're waving their banner. Freedom is not free, and every defense thing is a good thing. And another is suppression of dissent. So you have the criminalization of people like Julian Assange, who was a very effective anti-war voice until he was silenced, and now he's being persecuted in the UK. I mean, they took away, he was in the Ecuadorian embassy for quite a while, and then they took away his internet. So basically, their mission in that case is to get him to stop criticizing the MIC, and they've succeeded in that, even without getting him to trial yet. So suppression of dissent, dismissal of critics, the continual insertion of a pro-military view in all aspects of society. So a recent example would be the new film Top Gun Maverick, which I haven't actually seen yet, but apparently it made a huge splash, and all of these films from Hollywood, people may or may not know this, but they often are the directors and producers consult with the Pentagon, so they get on the pretext that they want to get the facts right. But in fact, they slant it a certain way. So if you saw Eye in the Sky, it really portrayed drone warfare as this positive thing, because it's skewed toward the propagandists in the Pentagon. And that's probably the biggest driving factor of all, is the fact that the Pentagon itself employs about 30,000 people full-time in public relations. Wow. It is these people's job to convince citizens that war is everywhere and anywhere good. Okay, so we are paying these people, they work for the Pentagon, and what their job is to convince us that everything the Pentagon does is good. So I would say that would be the primary driver of this whole thing. Why should 30,000 people be involved in marketing wars to us in various different ways? They're in every single avenue. You'll see them everywhere, lurking in the shadows. But people don't even know that this is the case. They figure the Pentagon is just a bunch of generals and colonels and getting ready for war. No, actually, there's this huge bureaucracy of people whose job it is to persuade you to believe that war is good.
And they're the ones that are really involved in like the cable news networks and even in like academia. Yes. And these are the kind of people that are going in there and influencing the narratives.
And tech. I mean, you could look at tech. Yeah. So they're insinuating themselves also into tech, influencing platforms such as Twitter and Facebook to, again, suppress text and images and stories that are critical of the MIC. So it's not coincidental that people who are strongly anti-war on Twitter get deplatformed, all the time, and on YouTube also. So they've made their way into the social media, because the social media have now become more important than the network news, and they're right on that.
Yeah, well, and this is where the Ukraine thing really doesn't make any sense to me, especially if you're coming to this as from someone on the right, because I do feel like there is on the right now more than ever kind of a push to be more anti-war. Like there are a lot of people that are in that space now that are open to criticizing it. I live in Kentucky 4, so Thomas Massey is my congressman, and so he's very vocally anti-war, which is great. But there were so many conservatives that correctly made the point during COVID that all of these companies like Google and like Facebook and CNN and Fox News, they all own stock in these pharmaceutical companies, right? And so there were a lot of conservatives that realized that and that made the very correct point that had to be influencing the way that COVID was being portrayed to the public. Why do you think that it's so hard for people to take that observation and then apply it to Ukraine, for instance?
The Ukraine case is really preposterous when you look at it. I mean, it's I have my penultimate essay at the Institute is called A Mad Heist, MAD, Mutually Assured Destruction Heist, where I point out that Noam Chomsky and Henry Kissinger, ideological enemies, agree on Ukraine. Their view is, sanely enough, that we need to get Zelensky and Putin to the negotiating table. But we've had no negotiating efforts on the part of our so-called diplomats, the president and Secretary of State Blinken. So it's a wild, wild case because the truth is that Russia is incredibly strongly armed with nuclear weapons. And if by some fluke Russia were to lose the Ukraine war conventionally, Putin has these nukes in his back pocket, and if he's pushed into a corner and he's told repeatedly that he's not going to survive, he may do something completely irrational, which is to use nuclear weapons. They would no longer be irrational in his mind if he thinks he's about to be assassinated anyway, which makes the whole thing so preposterous that some of these lawmakers, I believe most of them who have said this have been Republicans, but they keep claiming like Putin must go. Well, they said Gaddafi must go, and they said Saddam Hussein must go. And what happened to those guys? I mean, it was awful. So Putin, of course, knows what happened to those people, and it just makes him even more inclined, I think, to use these ultimate weapons of war if he feels like he's going to go out anyway. So basically, it's scary that they're playing with fire in this way. Mitt Romney is a person who's saying things like, "Oh yeah, we should prepare for a nuclear war." These people don't really understand what nuclear war is. So there was this New York City public service announcement about what to do in the event of a nuclear war, which was made by someone who has no idea what nuclear war is. I mean, like, go to the Hiroshima Peace Museum and look at those photos. And recognize the fact that if there is a nuclear war and you live in New York City, you are not going to exist anymore. If you live anywhere within 5 miles of New York City, because these big cosmopolitan cities are the ones that are targeted by these incredibly powerful weapons. But people are they're in a fog because they're so accustomed to this fictional portrayal of war that they don't process any of the actual consequences of any of the wars. And they don't even recognize the danger of provoking someone like Vladimir Putin in this case. They're more worried about being viewed as somehow selfish or a Putin puppet or a Putin sympathizer than they are with protecting the homeland. And that's where we've really gone into the cult territory. When people are advocating risking the end of our society because of a small border dispute, then they've really gone off the deep end, and we have to pull them in somehow.
Right. And that's a crazy thing. I've been reading through Scott Horton's new book, Hotter Than the Sun, which I knew that nuclear weapons were a problem, but man, this has been like really eye-opening to me, especially reading it in light of the conflict going on in Ukraine. I didn't realize just like how bad it was. And so it's amazing to me just how cavalier some of our political leaders are when they talk about this. Like, it's just, and then the fact that they talk about like, okay, so it's okay if we lose 1 or 2 cities, we can retaliate. Like that, just that kind of talk is so horrible to me. I just don't know how you don't think that the one nuclear weapon being launched on anyone anywhere on the planet is just unacceptable from my perspective. And they talk about it like it's not a big deal at all.
Well, this shows you the oligarchic nature of our society. So these people, some of them, have access to bunkers and shelters. So they aren't entirely afraid for themselves and their own families, and they just don't care about the little people. So if you're a high-level politician, I mean, even some, presidents, but also I think senators and representatives, you can actually access some of these facilities which are designed to protect people in the event of a nuclear war. So that sounds really cynical, but I think that's the only explanation, because I don't think these people are suicidal. They believe somehow that they're going to survive. So when Mitt Romney comes out and says, "Oh, we can't support Putin," no, we're not supporting Putin. We're supporting sanity. Right. It's like every war ends at the negotiation table. The only question is, how many people are going to kill? Yeah. Are you going to kill before you get there? Yeah. So this Ukraine thing has gone on and on and on. It looks like it's just dragging on, and the only actual effect effect of sending more and more weapons is to kill more and more people. And again, these are the little people who don't count, according to the people who are making policy. And I think it is telling when you have figures as antithetically opposed as Noam Chomsky, who's really an idealist about war. He thinks that war is essentially immoral, and Henry Kissinger, who's the realpolitik, Mandarin, if you like, over the last half century, and they come together and they agree that our policy on Ukraine is really mad, which is why I called my article a mad heist, because it's mutually assured destruction, but it just doesn't make any sense. Like, what is the strategic idea here? Even Kissinger, I should say Kissinger, recognizes that this is like an irrational approach that we're taking.
Well, and that's so going back to kind of one of the points that you made about 9/11 is that, when 9/11 happened, as you said, there was just this assumption made by the media. Obviously, the military industrial complex was influencing the kinds of conversations we could have about it. But there was this idea that there was no history before 9/11, that these people just attacked us out of the blue. We had done nothing. We were just over here enjoying our freedoms, and they didn't like that. And so they attacked us. But that's not the case. And again, you pushed it back into the 90s. And even before then, we've been so intimately involved in Middle Eastern politics for a long time that created the conditions under which the people that flew the planes into the towers would want to give up their lives to attack us. And we kind of see the same thing playing out with Ukraine right now, where everyone thinks that the Russians are just our enemies, and we don't understand why the Russians could be so angry with us, and attacking Ukraine is actually a threat to the United States. But there's a history of U.S. involvement that might make not what Vladimir Putin and the Russians are doing morally right, but it makes it understandable. Could you kind of go into that real quick? What's the background that we're not hearing to the war in Ukraine in the media?
Well, the 2014 coup. But I think what's interesting in this case is that even if you raise skeptical questions about various interpretations of what happened in 2014, did the CIA actually affect this coup, whatever, I think that you have to look at you can even set that question aside and look at other things that are going on. So war games on the border of Russia, NATO war games, and just these continual provocations of the expansion of NATO, and a complete forgetting of the raison d'etre of NATO. NATO is the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, which was established to counter the danger posed by the USSR. The Soviet Union, right, which does not exist. So throughout the Cold War, the big issue was, freedom or slavery, communism or capitalism. Well, now Russia is capitalist, so there's actually no reason to get involved in a huge war with Russia over a small border conflict. But people have forgotten about that. So they've rehydrated all this anti-USSR imagery. So the evil enemy, as though something were at stake. But in fact, all that's at stake is this border in Ukraine. And borders change. Borders are artifacts. They're established by small groups, usually of men in power, and they change over time. So I'm not saying that I don't agree with Vladimir Putin's invasion of Ukraine, and I actually was surprised by it. I didn't think he would do that. But he was for sure provoked by all the stuff that's going on, and his own little, characterization of saving the people of Ukraine from the Nazis. You can take that or leave it. I think it's just more pro-war propaganda, the kind that we use all the time. So, but the point is, he did have security concerns. So even if you question what happened in 2014, he did have security concerns based on what's going on with NATO in the region. And NATO, in my view, should have closed up the shop when the USSR dissolved, because that was the only reason it was established. Instead, what have they been doing? Well, they were wheeled in to prosecute the Kosovo War, and they were wheeled in to prosecute the Libya War. What happened to Libya? Well, it's actually in shambles now, and that was made possible by NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, which was established in order to protect the West against the Soviet Union, which does not even exist anymore. So basically, at this point, NATO's just trying to justify its existence. And I think that, I disagree with Putin's invasion, but he certainly has reasons, and the U.S. government has just ignored those security concerns, as though we wouldn't react similarly if someone came to our neck of the woods, as happened in the Cuban
Right,
Missile
right,
Crisis, which almost led to a nuclear war because the missiles were amassed on an island very close to us. Fortunately, cooler heads prevailed, but it was a close call. And I guess you're learning from Scott's book, there have been many
yeah,
other close calls just because of human
right,
fallibility. Like sometimes it's just a mistake. Like someone can just
right,
push a button, or something can, a piece of machinery can degrade, and the thing can be set off, and then it's a ricochet. Once one bomb is launched, then it just goes on. It's a ricochet until mutually
right,
assured destruction. That's supposed to prevent it from happening. But the problem with that equation is that human beings are fallible.
right.
So, so they make mistakes, and they're not always that stable. There are a couple of really good films about the prospect of nuclear holocaust. One I'm sure you know is Dr. Strangelove, or How I Learned to Stop Worrying and Loved the Atomic Bomb, Stanley Kubrick film. The other is Failsafe, a Sidney Lumet film, which came out the very same year. I think they were both in 1964, and they both underscore and highlight. I highly recommend them to your
Okay.
podcast listeners. How we've put all of this power to annihilate civilization into a single person, which is incredibly dangerous because that person could have a random electron event, could be like Biden. He's constantly just spouting out stuff. Well, maybe he'll just say yes when he means no. You just it's incredibly dangerous to have this
Right.
much power in the hands of a single person, and especially above all now. I mean, this was justified in the minds of the policy architects throughout the Cold War as necessary to avoid the takeover of the
Right.
world by communism. Well, that's no longer a danger. So why would we risk this for anything less than
Yeah.
that? I mean, a lot of people would say better dead than red. That's
Right.
not an issue. So what's the issue now? Let Ukraine have its way, or I mean, there's no issue that rises to the level of justifying in anyone's mind, even the most bellicose leader's mind, a nuclear conflict.
Yeah. Well, and I think that too, from my looking at this from a historical perspective, it's pretty obvious to me that since the military-industrial complex makes lots and lots of money when the United States is in a state of war, so we end the Cold War and the threat of worldwide communism is gone, and it doesn't surprise me that just 10 years later, the next global threat is Islamic radical terrorism. That they've replaced one existential threat with another, and I kind of feel the same thing playing out. Like it's hard for me, knowing what I know about the military-industrial complex now, to think that with the war in Afghanistan coming to an end last fall, I'm sure that was a big hit for the military-industrial complex, and then all of a sudden, fast forward to springtime, and now we're involved in another conflict far away where the Congress is giving lots and lots of money to these defense contracting companies to fight this war. Do you think that kind of has something to do with this? That the military-industrial they need conflict because they benefit from that?
Oh, absolutely. Every time we get involved anywhere in the world, Raytheon stock goes up. So that's another example of someone, even people who aren't employed in the MIC directly, if they hold stocks in Raytheon, Boeing, Lockheed Martin, etc., they actually get rich because we're sending these weapons abroad. So I think even as the rest of the stock market is foundering,
Right.
the only stocks that are good now. So if you're a player on the market, you're going to get your Boeing and your Lockheed and your Raytheon, and then that motivates you to support further intervention because you have financial interests, even if you're not processing it directly. Like you're not connecting death with your stock portfolio, but in fact there's a direct connection, because what happens is we either use these weapons or we send them to other people who use them, and then the stocks have to be replenished. So that's why it's turned into this this self-perpetuating machine, because supposedly in the name of defense we have to have all of our arsenals stocked. So when we send 40 billion tons, $40 billion of weapons to Ukraine, that means we're taking them out of our stockpile. And then, of course, the logic is, oh, we need to be ready for war with China. So now they're provoking China, and Iran simultaneously. I mean, it's hard to understand what these people think they're doing if it's not just to promote the MIC, because they're not stabilizing the world, they're destabilizing it. So when Pelosi took her little trip to Taiwan, China immediately withdrew from all of these bilateral agreements with the United States. So how did we benefit? We're taxpayers. She went on a junket that cost like $100 million to do. And the consequence of it is that we're now like semi-enemies with China. Like, oh, great. Like, it's nuts, really.
Right. It really is. And if you think about it too, like there's absolutely no reason for these conflicts whatsoever. And if you go over to China, and like I could go to China, and there's no one over there that would hate me individually, and I have no problem with anyone over there individually. But it's like our government and the governments of these other countries, they can't help themselves. It's like they have to have some sort of conflict, despite the fact that I think most reasonable people living in the world would just want peace. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah, that's right. But peace does not pay. Okay, war is incredibly lucrative, and peace does not pay. Peace doesn't like use up munitions. It doesn't. Yeah, that's the bottom line here. I mean, it's sad and it sounds cynical, but in fact, that's the driving factor. It's money, and unlike normal capitalism, the defense industry is a crony capitalist system where they get money no matter what. So it doesn't matter what they do. They don't have to meet any standards of competence whatsoever. They just have this steady stream of money that's siphoned from the coffers of taxpayers. And so there's no incentive for them not to do this because they just get more and more money no matter what they do. So they develop these more and more vicious weapons that will be used to kill people, and then it just goes forward from there. So then these weapons end up in people's hands. So a good example is Saddam Hussein gassed the Kurds. Well, where did he get the chemical weapons to do that? Give you one guess. They were developed by DARPA in the United States, and the material was provided both by the United States and the technology, and also other Western nations. So then he had these things in his arsenal, and he used them. Surprise! People use the weapons in their arsenal. And so we are actually creating these these enemies. Everywhere we send these weapons, we're empowering people to become murderous despots.
Right. Yeah, and it just perpetuates this problem. One of the things that I think it's been, and especially because you see this on social media and in the news and everything, like we have all these famous celebrities that are going over to Ukraine and posing with Zelensky and doing all of this kind of crazy stuff over there. And then, like when I talk about this with people, they think that a lot of the money that we're sending to Ukraine is going to actually help the people that are affected by the war. And I'm always like, no, these are actually mostly going to defense contractors. So of the $40 billion, do you think that any of it is actually going to benefit the people that are impacted by the war? Or is this all just for the politicians and the defense companies?
I keep putting tweets up that say war as photo op. My latest one was Zelensky posing with Jessica Chastain. Jessica Chastain, who is a good actress, starred in Zero Dark 30, which is a Hollywood production which portrayed the use of torture as somehow positive. So here she is, I guess, giving him some consulting on what to do in Ukraine. I mean, it's unbelievable. And it's just photo op after photo op. All of these politicians are going over there from all different countries, and it does seem to be more about promoting their own image than it does the Ukrainian people. It's unclear to me that any of these people who are doing photo ops with Zelensky actually care about the Ukrainians. If they cared about the Ukrainians, they would want all of the firing of weapons to stop.
Yeah, they want peace.
Because the people who get killed in these bombings are often civilians. I mean, just look at the war on terror. Like, we took out a small handful of people who were directly responsible for 9/11, who should have been pursued as criminals. And along the way, millions of people who had nothing to do with it. And the same thing will happen and is happening in Ukraine. The longer it goes on, the more civilians will be killed and the more civilian structures will be destroyed. So it's hard for me to understand what these people think they're accomplishing beyond burnishing their own public image by posing for these photo ops. I mean, what do they think?
My absolute favorite one was Ben Stiller. And I think Ben Stiller, he's a really funny actor. Love Dodgeball, love all of his work. But it's like he goes over there and shakes hands with Zelensky, and then everyone in America thinks that that's just like Ben Stiller's a comedian, and he might be an intelligent guy. I don't know, but this doesn't. When I see that image, it just all seems like a giant joke.
No, it does. I mean, I think we got a little bit, you mentioned COVID, and we got a little bit of this throughout the COVID crisis. I mean, there was some
Oh
crazy
yeah.
stuff going on
Oh
through
yeah.
that too. And in the COVID crisis, the insanity of the general population was at a much higher level, I think, because people were genuinely
Right.
afraid because of the way the disease was depicted by so-called experts on the television. And so the people who were on television 24/7 for that 2-year period, they ended up like developing hypochondria and paranoia. Now they're like afraid of germs. They don't want to leave their houses anymore, even still. So the people who didn't watch the television, they're like, hey, wait a minute. This virus has like a 0.5% lethality. For certain
Right.
vulnerable populations. So people who were skeptical about it tried to express their skepticism, and in many cases were
Right.
deplatformed. And then you had these celebrities again coming out. I think Jennifer Aniston came out and said she was not talking to people who were
Right.
unvaccinated. Like she was just letting all of her unvaccinated friends go. And this was supposed to be like her way of contributing to the greater good. It's crazy that these celebrities get somehow wheeled into it. But we can just take note when they do this and withhold judgment, on whether they have anything good to say. But just when we see them doing it in COVID and then doing it in the war, you realize it does have more to do with their
Right.
image than with
Right. It's
anything
not. It's not
else.
because they're actual principled people that care about the problems that are going on in the world. They
Right.
care about making themselves look virtuous. And this is like what happens. I mean, every time there's a school shooting or anything like that, you always get the celebrities that come out and they post and they get on TV and they congratulate themselves. But none of this actually does anything to solve these problems.
Exactly. It's virtue
Yeah.
signaling, pure and simple in its most disgusting form. Honestly, I mean, I've noticed like there's a inverse relation between people who like virtue signal and people who actually do things.
Right.
Like,
Yeah.
so, so,
Yeah.
so, like, if you see all the people in your neighborhood who have those signs, like
Oh.
we
Oh
believe
yeah.
that every human is legal, and then right next to it they have like a security sign that says this house is protected by
Right.
ADT security. So it's like it's just like
Yeah.
massive contradictions left and right. I mean, these people are not seriously going to allow anyone to come into their house, but they have these signs and they do this virtue signaling. um, when I say people to come into their house, I mean
Right.
like the
Yeah.
local homeless population or whatever. So they actually don't do anything but put the sign in their yard or do the photo op, with Zelensky. They don't do any other action that's not self-promoting. So you can sort of see through the virtue signaling, but it's become very popular, very dominant, and somehow people have now decided that having an opinion makes you moral or immoral as opposed
Right.
to actually doing things. So I don't know. That came about through years of media propagation of the idea, where people now believe, that if you hate bad people, this makes you a good
Right.
person,
It
which
is
is
really
really
strange too,
odd.
and it's always been frustrating to me because like the church that I go to is really involved in our community, and they do a lot of great community work, and we donate money and we go out and we serve the people in our community, and so we have that going on while at the same time, like I have friends that are very concerned about like social inequality and injustice and all of that kind of stuff, but that never do anything. I'm like, hey, if you're really serious about this, then like find some sort of outlet and like do something to solve the problem instead of just talking about it on social media or whatever. But that gets back to what you were saying, and I wrote it down here because I loved this phrase so much. But you said when you say that the military-industrial complex, as you said before, is bigger than just the military and defense, you call it the military-industrial, congressional, media, academic, pharmaceutical, logistics, banking complex, which just goes to show you how all of these ideas are just intertwined in society, and it does make it really difficult for people that aren't familiar with the Libertarian Institute or other organizations like that to kind of see through all of the crap that's being thrown at them all day. What would be some of the what's the best way to try to undo that system, that network of all of these interests that make it impossible for us to get good information about the war or about COVID or about anything like that?
Well, we have to resist any attempt to suppress speech. So they brought out this idea of the Disinformation Governance Bureau, which is so Orwellian and so unbelievable. Fortunately, it was taken down, but I imagine that they are working behind the scenes because you
Yeah.
see the effects anyway in tech. So I would say alternative platforms where they don't censor speech. The most important thing is our ability to speak. If we lose our ability to speak, then we've lost everything. At that point, we descend in quickly into a totalitarian system where people are criminalized for having the wrong opinion. for expressing the wrong opinion, and even for having the wrong opinion. And that's incredibly dangerous. It's the opposite of what we want to promote. And so we have to keep writing and talking, and also interacting with people on a local level, because a lot of people, I mean, they're in a way not culpably ignorant. It's just that everything they see on their television promotes a certain perspective, and that's all they see. So on the ground, you can interact with people in your community and say, hey, look, there are actually other perspectives, and maybe like turn off the television because it's turned into just this propaganda outlet. It's really the ministry of propaganda. If you're watching television, your brain is being poisoned at this point. I mean, I don't care which network you choose. They're really, really bad. I mean, I think it was made much worse by the Smith-Mundt Modernization Act of 2013, which legalized the use of propaganda by the government against U.S. citizens. It used to be that the government was forbidden from propagandizing its own citizens. That was lifted in 2013, and so look into that. I have an article about that too.
Congress and signed into law by Obama?
Yeah, that was also Obama. I know Obama has this long list of like horrific things he's done, which is really sad. I mean, but just true. I know the more you look at his presidency, the more you're like, whoa. But anyway, so that was a big factor. So right after that happened, you would see people like John Brennan, who had been recently named the CIA director, always doing the media circuits. So the director of the CIA is propagandizing us, all the time now, and all these other figures who appear regularly, they have like a direct line to the government and the State Department and the CIA. So if you're watching television, viewer beware. You're getting a particular slanted perspective, particularly, I mean, it's always been that way to some degree, but since 2013, it's much, much worse. So people should be warned about this. And we also have to resist the use of censorship in all these other platforms. I mean, I think that a lot of liberty lovers were happy about the prospect of Elon Musk taking over Twitter because he seems to be pro-free speech, whether or not this will come to fruition. It's certainly the case that they've deplatformed lots of people who just have perspectives that differ with the official story. So in COVID, doctors, I mean, people who are credentialed scientists and experts, research scientists, were deplatformed for expressing opinions that differed from those of Anthony Fauci. That was scary, honestly. And if we get that sort of takeover, then all will be lost. But it's not over yet. So basically, at this point, we just have to recognize what's going on and talk to people in the community and try to maybe influence politics at the local level and the state level. Washington, D.C. at this point is just such a nightmare in terms of...
They're hopeless.
Yeah, they might be hopeless, but like little by little, getting people in from the ground up. And I mean that libertarians should support progressives, and progressives should support libertarians. We have to have some coalitions, in order to make any headway against the war party duopoly, because the Republicans and the Democrats at this point in history are indistinguishable on foreign policy.
They are.
I mean, you can't. Yeah.
Well, and that's where, with Bernie Sanders sponsoring the joint resolution in Congress to try to end the war in Yemen, him and Thomas Massie and Rand Paul, all signing on to that. I think that's awesome. And I think that people that are liberty-minded need to give Bernie Sanders complete credit for that, because he's 100% correct on that issue.
Yeah. I mean, I think that what the war party wants us to do is to have all this fighting at the lower level where we can never achieve any power because we're always fighting about little things. But the big thing here is war. Right. And we can agree, I think, people outside the war party who haven't been co-opted and haven't been sucked in by the tentacles of the MIC, we can agree that this is really an atrocity, that we are engaged in this nonstop campaign of government-inflicted mass homicide on people wherever the government decides to drop bombs. I mean, it's really it's criminal, is what it is, and we can agree on that. So, I think we have to prioritize that issue, because that's where all the power right now lies. If the government has the power to kill anyone, anywhere, for any reason, at any time, then they're essentially a tyrant
Yeah.
at this point. So they already killed U.S. citizens during the War on Terror without indictment or trial, and they clearly are willing to kill anyone they want to, anywhere they want to. So that has to be stopped, because with that power they can kill every critic, they can destroy every critic, like Julian Assange. Anyone who comes up and actually starts to have an effect, which he did. He started to have an effect by exposing many of the documents which showed what the War on Terror was really like and what was really happening. But then he was shut down. So
And
I think we have to.
I totally agree, and I'm actually a little optimistic about this, because I feel like, so I've been pretty consistent about COVID all the way through, that it was very serious for a certain sector of the population, but the government was very much overreacting to it, and there were a lot of very sketchy things that were happening behind the scenes going on with COVID. And we're at the point now where I would have conversations with people that I know last year, and they thought I was crazy for thinking that it could have leaked from a lab in Wuhan, and they were saying that I was crazy, that the vaccines could potentially injure some people, that there could be, for at least a small amount of the population, potential problems that came from taking the vaccine. But now that that whole COVID regime is starting to unravel, even people that were totally against those positions last year are starting to see, okay, maybe the government did overstep here. Are you optimistic that maybe between COVID and then, even if that kind of same thing happens with Ukraine, are you optimistic that people might be more aware of the problems that are created by this, or do you think that this machine is just going to keep on going?
That's a really interesting question. I think that the failure of the COVID regime, this idea of mandating medical treatments on people, that failed. All over the world. It looked really scary for a while, as though it were going to succeed, but it looks like it failed. So unless they come up with some other super virus, and do a repeat of the whole thing, in which case people will be on their guard.
Right.
Because now that everyone is looking at the statistics and seeing how the data was manipulated by the companies and all of the interests involved, and looking at the actual lethality and the statistics, and how particularly the increase in deaths among people who were not vulnerable, but they died because of the lockdowns all over the world. You're right, people have been awakened to the power that the government was exerting on them during that 2-year period. So that's good. And if we could transfer that state of awakenedness to war, that would be wonderful. And it's a little depressing, but I think that one way that more people might become awake is because of the financial troubles here in the United States and all over the world, and not only as a result of the lockdowns, but also because of the profligate military excursions. So if people are not able to afford gas and to pay for their heating this winter, and they can't afford food, at some point they're going to wake up and say, why are we sending $40 billion to Ukraine so that they can argue over a border? We have things to do here, and this could lead people to reject their representative. Say, you are no longer representing me, because this is what I care about, and this is how my life has been degraded over the last 2 years, and you need to address our issues, our crumbling infrastructure, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, before you go start another war somewhere just to throw money into the military industry. Because, as I said, we didn't get anything out of it. Americans didn't get anything out of it. A lot of people lost things, people who lost family members, and the tragedy of the lives destroyed, just among the troops themselves, not even talking about the people in the Middle East. That's awful. But Americans themselves were harmed, because the deficit now is completely out of control. And we now have a group of politicians who think that they can just print money for anything, which of course increases inflation. Right? We know we have an inflation problem, so what do? They're going to print more money. So how is that supposed to solve? They don't know economics. They don't know what they're doing. It's really obvious. And so at some point, you're right, people may start to become more and more receptive to criticisms of the government, because they recognize that the government does not represent them and is not furthering their own interests anymore. In fact, they're robbing us. So when that happens, we should see hopefully more anti-war sentiment.
Perfect. Just a couple more questions for you. One of the so let's say that we convince everyone in America to start reading the Libertarian Institute, every single day, and 10 years from now, the military industrial complex is completely undone, and we don't have to deal with that problem anymore. There are a lot of people that I've talked to, and I had a conversation with a really good friend just a couple of days ago who is like a libertarian leaning conservative, and he's like, I'm with you on all the military industrial complex stuff, but I just don't know. There are always going to be threats in the world, and I just don't know if I would be willing to give up all of the perceived security that the military industrial complex supposedly provides us with. What would be in a world without the military industrial complex in a kind of an optimal military role for the United States, given that at least at this time we are still the most wealthy country in the world?
That's an interesting question. I mean, there are two places on the planet which no longer have a military. One of them is Costa Rica. Costa Rica decided not to be a part of these military games, and they abolished their military. They also abolished capital punishment, I think in the 19th century, so a very different place. And there, I mean, they, of course, have the usual security concerns locally, but they don't get into fights with other countries. And so ideally, I would say that we would need to go back to a position according to which defense is defense. Okay, so we defend our borders, we defend ourselves from incoming attacks, but we don't go out and bomb people and pretend that that is an act of defending our borders. When in fact we're perpetrating horrors and we're increasing the number of our enemies by doing this. So we're actually endangering ourselves. It's an example of the same thing. The more we do that, the more enemies we have, and then it just goes on and on and on. So the main thing is we have to stop intervening. And it's sad, but this idea of isolationism has been painted so negatively, so that a lot of Americans now, they've been propagandized to believe that if you're an isolationist, that's something evil. Well, an isolationist just doesn't want to have our government go kill a bunch of people abroad. That's what it means. I mean, it doesn't mean that we're not engaged in dialogue with other leaders of states. It doesn't mean that we can't adjudicate disputes between other countries, as we should be doing with Zelensky and Putin, but we're not. It just means that we recognize that bombing people is not the solution to the problem. In fact, you're still going to have to sit down at the negotiation table, even after you kill a bunch of people. So why not do it before rather than after? And that would be great if we had a foreign policy that would come back to the idea of last resort, and the idea that we always try to talk out our differences, because there will be disagreements and there will be differences. But civil people can have a dialogue about these things and come up with agreements and compromises, instead of just unilaterally proclaiming that the enemy cannot be reasoned with, and therefore we're going to go kill all the people in his country. I mean, it's preposterous.
Right. Diplomacy and trade over force is what you're saying. Yeah.
Yes, there you go. Diplomacy and trade.
All right, we love it. So the last question that I want to ask you today is, so obviously the piece was incredible, and again, describing the military-industrial complex as a cult, I think, was spot on. If you were going to make this argument to a religious audience, so if you're going into a church or someplace like that, what would kind of be your end for the military? So you're trying to explain the military-industrial complex to people that might have grown up conservative in a kind of a conservative religious environment. What would be your angle as you try to approach those kinds of people?
Well, as I do in my book, War and Delusion, I sharply distinguish what has become the practice of the military from the act of self-defense. So they call these interventions missions of national defense, but they actually bear no resemblance to legitimate self-defense. So I do believe that people have a right to defend themselves against aggressors, to protect the perimeters of their property, and to fend off enemies who are threatening them with violence and death. So I think you, as a religious person, we have to come back to the actual meaning of "thou shalt not kill." It's been reevaluated to mean "thou shalt not murder," and then define every act of killing that we perpetrate as an act of self-defense, and every act of murder that they perpetrate, of killing that they perpetrate, as an act of murder. But when you look at the details of the cases, it's not actually that simple. That's a very simple-minded way of looking at it. And people, again, have been habituated to this idea. So the notion of collateral damage, for example, is just a euphemism for dead civilians, dead children, and people who have nothing to do with the conflict. So I think we have to be more critical of that concept of collateral damage and not pretend that this is somehow okay. So for example, last year, on the way out of Afghanistan, Biden's military used a drone to kill 10 people in Kabul, and they initially painted this as an act of national defense. They were defending the people at the Kabul airport who were getting ready to leave, and et cetera, et cetera. It turned out that it was an aid worker and 9 other people, 7 of whom were children. And I think that people who are religious need to take seriously these cases and say, look at what we did. We actually paid to kill 10 entirely innocent people, destroy their lives, playing God in this case, right? So we ended their lives on really scanty evidence, and we have to stand up against it. Unfortunately, it just people just forgot about it. It happened, and then it was unfortunate. It was uncovered. It was just brushed aside as collateral damage. But when you look at the case, they killed this guy based on the fact that he was driving a white Toyota Corolla, and he looked like he was suspicious. He was like moving water around town or something. So if those are the types of evidence that they're using to decide to execute people, I think we have to stand up against that, which is why, of course, I wrote my first book on drone killing, which is called We Kill Because We Can, From Soldiering to Assassination in the Drone Age. I mean, we have to ask whether we as the citizenry are willing to condone this. I mean, we paid for it. If you pay federal taxes, you paid for that. You paid for those 10 people's lives to be killed, to be ended. And we have to hold, I think, our politicians responsible for these things. Instead of just allowing them to say automatically, oh, it's collateral damage, mistakes were made, we have to analyze, we have to ask them to revise their procedures and consider what exactly they're doing, and also to reconsider the value of human life. I mean, those are lives, those are precious lives, and they were ended by our military for really ridiculous reasons. And most Americans just sort of go on with their lives, go back to the mall and don't even realize it happened. And then they did a drone strike last week or a couple weeks ago, and they tried to turn it into this big victory for the war on terror. So this number 2 Al-Qaeda guy supposedly taken out. The truth is, we don't actually have any grounds for believing that this really happened. The guy may have died years before. We don't know. I mean, I don't want to be a total cynic. But the truth is that because of what happened last year, we don't have any real grounds for believing anything the government says, because the government comes out and tells us, paints this picture of, oh yeah, we're victorious, we got this guy before he took out the Kabul airport, and it was complete fabrication. The whole narrative was like what they wanted it to be, but it was completely false. So we don't know what happened in this latest case, but I think that religious people just have to take more seriously the sanctity of human life and the fact that, we're paying for this. There are things that religious people can do. They can refuse to pay taxes. They can join the war tax resistance movement, etc. Because these are the consequences of the policies that we're condoning.
That's perfect. Well, thank you, Laurie. Again, I really appreciate you being on the show today. For my listeners, where can they find you, find your work, follow you on social media? People that want to follow up on this, how can they find what you're putting out?
Sure. I have a blog which is dedicated to my drone warfare book. It's called thedroneage.wordpress. And as you said, I'm at the Libertarian Institute. If you do a /L Calhoun, all of my articles will come up. So you can put libertarian.org/L Calhoun. Everything will come up. So I have quite a few articles there. And then I do have these books, but they're listed in publications at my blog. I'm on Twitter. I'm not a huge fan of Twitter, actually, but I go on there because I can't watch network news anymore. So I get a little bit of news from Twitter. I mean, I can't stomach it anymore. So that's Laurie Calhoun is my Twitter handle. That's about it.
All right. Well, Laurie, thanks again for talking to the Protestant Libertarian today. I'm going to be putting links to all of Laurie's books and her page at the Libertarian Institute in the show notes. You guys can check that out. Thank you guys again for listening to the end of the show, and we will see you all next Tuesday. Thanks for listening to another episode of the Protestant Libertarian Podcast. If you have any questions or comments or thoughts about the show, please reach out to me at theprotestantlibertarian@gmail.com. You can also follow me on Twitter @ProLibertyPod. Again, you can and follow me on Twitter at ProLibertyPod. You can also support the show by leaving a rating or a review on your favorite podcast app. Thank you guys so much for listening, and we'll see you next week.